silver dollar spins in the air above a crowded saloon, catching the lamplight for exactly the amount of time it takes a man to decide whether he's about to become a legend or a body on the floor. Cole Harlan doesn't blink, doesn't breathe different, doesn't do any of the things a man is supposed to do in the half second before he either proves something or dies proving it. The coin turns once, twice. His hand moves. We'll get to that moment. Every story worth telling makes you wait for the part you already know is coming, and this one's no different. So let's back up. Let's start where Cole started that afternoon, 3 hours before anybody in that room at saloon had any idea what kind of day they'd wandered into. The town was called Larkspur, and it sat in the Wyoming Territory the way a lot of towns sat in the Wyoming Territory that year, recently, and without much confidence that the arrangement would last. Cole had ridden in from the northeast with Shadow moving at the unhurried pace that meant nothing ahead had spooked him, which was, as far as Cole was concerned, the only weather report worth trusting. He wasn't hunting anyone. That mattered, and it's worth saying plainly, because most of the stories people tell about Cole Harlan start with him already chasing something, or being chased by it. This one didn't. This one started with a man who wanted a whiskey, a quiet corner, and 2 hours to kill before he was due to meet a rancher named Whitfield about a job that had nothing to do with guns, and everything to do with tracking 11 head of stolen cattle through country Cole knew better than most. He tied Shadow at the rail outside the Larkspur saloon, ran a hand along the black coat the way he always did, checked the white left foreleg out of a habit 6 years deep, and walked inside. The place was alive in the particular way a saloon gets alive on a Saturday afternoon, when the ranch hands have been paid, and the ranch work is, for a few hours, somebody else's problem. A piano in the corner worked its way through something lively and a little out of tune. Card tables were full. A group of cowboys near the window were laughing at something none of them would remember by Monday. The bartender, an older man with a gray mustache and the tired good humor of someone who'd kept a bar for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by much of anything, moved down the counter with the ease of long practice. Cole took the stool at the far end, removed his hat, ordered a whiskey, and for about 40 minutes nothing happened that anybody would ever tell a story about. That's the part people forget when they hear this one secondhand. Before it was anything, it was just a man having a drink. The 3 men on the other side of the room had been there since before Cole arrived, and they'd been getting louder the entire time Cole had been quiet. Their names, Cole would learn eventually, though it hardly mattered in the moment, were Dutch Calloway, Amos Reyes, and a younger one who went by Whit, 19, maybe 20, with a kind of confidence that hadn't yet been tested by anything that actually cost him something. Dutch was the loudest of the 3, and clearly considered himself the fastest gun in whatever room he happened to occupy, an opinion he'd apparently never once had reason to doubt. They'd turned the saloon into a stage. That was the only honest way to describe it. Somebody would throw a whiskey glass into the air, and one of the 3 would draw and shatter it before it hit the floorboards, and the crowd, half amused, half genuinely impressed, the way crowds get when they're watching something dangerous happen to somebody else's furniture, would cheer, and money would change hands, and the whole cycle would start again, louder than before. Here's the thing about young men who are good with a gun and haven't yet been anywhere that tested it. The confidence isn't fake. That's what makes it dangerous. Dutch Calloway really was fast. He'd hit every glass so far. The trouble wasn't his aim. Trouble was what fast, untested confidence does to a man's math when the stakes suddenly get higher than a broken glass. By the 5th round, the bets had climbed considerably, and the glasses had climbed with them. Higher throws, harder angles, the specific escalation of men trying to impress a room that was already impressed, and didn't know how to signal that the show could stop now. On the 6th round, Whit threw the glass considerably higher than any before it, full of whiskey still. An unnecessary flourish meant to make the shot look harder than it needed to be. Dutch fired. The glass shattered exactly where it was supposed to. Nobody had accounted for was the arc of the whiskey and the glass fragments it carried, spraying outward in a wide, glittering fan across a room that hadn't been built with a shooting gallery in mind. And Cole Harland, 40 feet away at the end of the bar, minding a whiskey that belonged entirely to him, caught the worst of it directly across his chest. The saloon went quiet in the way saloons go quiet right before something happens that everybody in the room will spend the rest of their life describing slightly differently. Cole set his glass down. He didn't do it hard, didn't slam it, didn't make a show of it. He simply set it down with the same unhurried care he'd used to pick it up 40 minutes earlier, and looked down at the whiskey soaking into his coat, and then looked up at the three men across the room. He said nothing. That was, as it turned out, the single most unsettling thing he could have done. A man who shouts, a man who curses, a man who storms across a room, those are men whose next move you can predict. A man who says nothing at all, who simply looks at you with an expression that gives away exactly nothing, is a man whose next move nobody in that saloon had any way of guessing. Dutch Calloway, who had not yet in his young life encountered a silence he correctly understood, mistook it for something else entirely. "Is it, old man?" he called, grinning at his two friends before the words had even finished leaving his mouth. "You want to bet too?" Amos and Whit laughed. It was the specific laughter of young men who'd been winning all afternoon, and it started somewhere around round 4, to believe the winning was a permanent condition, rather than a temporary one. Cole looked at Dutch for a long moment. Then slowly he glanced down at his own belt, at the revolver hanging there. Worn grips gone smooth and dark with age. The finish faded to a dull gray-brown that had clearly not seen a polishing cloth in longer than Whit had been alive. It looked, to every eye in that saloon, exactly like what it appeared to be. An old gun that had traveled a great many miles and had not been treated to much ceremony along the way. "No," Cole said. He let that sit a moment. Throw a silver dollar into the air. He picked his whiskey back up, took a slow sip, unbothered by the wet coat, unbothered by the room's attention now fully turned toward him. "I'll bet against all three of you for a second." Nobody said anything at all. Then Dutch started laughing, and once Dutch started, Amos and Whit followed, the specific laughter of men who have just been handed something they consider an early Christmas. "That thing," Dutch said, nodding at Cole's revolver. "That belongs in a museum, old man. I've seen fence posts in better condition. Probably couldn't hit the side of a barn from 10 feet," Amos added, still grinning. Cole didn't argue the point. He simply set his glass down again, stood and walked toward the center of the room, with the unhurried gait of a man who had nowhere else he particularly needed to be. "Then it's an easy bet for you," he said. "Toss the coin." Word travels fast in a room that's already paying attention, and by the time the first silver dollar was pulled from somebody's pocket, every card game in the saloon had quietly folded itself. Every conversation had died down to nothing, and the entire room had reorganized itself into a rough half-circle around the space Cole had claimed as his own. The bartender, his name, Cole would learn, was Silas Vance, and he'd been keeping this particular bar for going on 19 years, leaned against the counter with the wary stillness of a man who had seen a great many saloon wagers go badly and had developed strong opinions about which ones were about to. Dutch held up the coin. "First round's on me," he said, "since you're so eager to lose your money." "Toss it," Cole said. Dutch tossed it. The coin went up in a lazy arc, catching the afternoon light coming through the front windows, and for exactly the length of time it takes a silver dollar to reach the top of its rise and begin its fall, the entire saloon held one collective breath. Cole's hand moved. Nobody in that room, not Dutch, not Amos, not Whit, not a single ranch hand who'd spent the last hour watching three young men perform exactly this kind of trick, had ever seen a draw that fast. It wasn't dramatic. That was the strange part of it. There was no flourish, no wasted motion, nothing that announced itself as impressive before it happened. One moment Cole's hand was at his side. The next, the old revolver was up. The shot had cracked through the room, and the silver dollar spun sideways through the air, trailing a bright new hole clean through its center before it ever reached the floorboards. It landed with a small ringing sound that seemed, in the silence that followed, unreasonably loud. Dutch stared at it, then at Cole, then at the revolver, already holstered again, as if it had never left. "Luck," Dutch said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Could be," Cole said, and returned to his stool. "I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because it's the whole story in miniature." Three young men who'd built an entire afternoon's reputation on being the fastest, most impressive guns in that saloon had just watched an old man in a worn coat put a bullet through a coin without so much as setting down his whiskey glass first. And instead of taking that as the warning it plainly was, they doubled down. That's the part of this story that never stops being true about young men convinced of their own math. The warning doesn't register as a warning. It registers as a fluke to be corrected. The second coin went up higher than the first, Amos throwing this time, determined to prove the first shot had been a trick of angle rather than skill. Cole hit it dead center. The third round, they doubled the bet, and Witt threw it with a spin meant to complicate the shot. Cole hit it dead center. Round after round, the wagers climbed. The coins went higher. The angles got trickier. And round after round, Cole Harlan stood in the middle of that saloon floor with the same unbothered expression he'd worn since he first stood up from his stool, reloading between shots with the same unhurried care he did everything else, sipping his whiskey when there was a pause long enough to allow it, and saying each time, in the same flat, quiet voice, "Again." He never smiled, never made a show of the wins piling up on the bar beside him, never once looked at the three young men with anything that could be called satisfaction. If anything, there was something almost gentle in how little pleasure he seemed to be taking from it. The specific restraint of a man who understood exactly what this was costing the three of them, and had no interest in making it cost more than it needed to. By the 8th round, the crowd had stopped watching Dutch, Amos, and Witt throw the coins at all. They'd turned entirely toward Cole, toward the old revolver, toward the specific, impossible consistency of a man who had not missed a single shot in a room full of men who'd started the afternoon believing they were the ones worth watching. Silas Vance behind the bar had gone very still. He'd seen fast guns before. Larkspur had its share of them passing through. But he'd never seen anything that looked quite like this. Not speed exactly, though the speed was real, but a kind of certainty that made the outcome feel decided before the coin had even left the thrower's hand. By the 12th round, the three young men had lost nearly every dollar they'd walked in with that afternoon. The saloon had gone quieter than it had been all day, the specific quiet of a room that had stopped being entertained and started being genuinely uneasy about what it's watching. And Dutch Calloway stood at the center of that quiet, with an expression that had traveled, over the course of 12 rounds, from amusement to disbelief to something considerable. Darker. He'd lost, publicly, thoroughly, in front of every ranch hand and card player and bartender in a town he'd apparently intended to spend the rest of the month impressing. And men who have built their entire sense of themselves around being the fastest gun in whatever room they occupy do not, as a rule, absorb that kind of loss gracefully. "That's it," Dutch said, though his voice had gone tight in a way that suggested the words weren't really finished with him yet. "We're done." "Your bet," Cole said, not unkind, just accurate. "I said we're done." Cole didn't push it. He gathered the winnings from the table with the same unhurried care he'd shown all afternoon, counting out a portion and setting it aside on the bar in front of Silas Vance. Payment, unasked, for whatever the afternoon's excitement had cost the saloon in broken glass and rattled nerves, and then turned back toward his stool, toward his coat still faintly damp with whiskey, toward the drink he'd never actually finished. He turned his back. That was, everyone in the saloon would agree afterward, the moment Dutch Calloway made the only decision of that entire afternoon that couldn't be walked back. Here's the part of the story I always come back to when I tell this one, because it's the part that actually explains everything else. Dutch hadn't lost because Cole was lucky. He hadn't even really lost because Cole was faster, though he was. He lost because somewhere around round 8, watching a man old enough to be his father put 12 consecutive bullets through 12 consecutive spinning coins without so much as raising his voice, Some part of Dutch Calloway understood exactly what kind of man he was standing across from and decided, in the specific, catastrophic logic of a young man who cannot survive being seen losing, that the only way out of that understanding was to make sure nobody in that room ever got to say it out loud. Cole heard it before he saw it. The particular sound of leather shifting against a holster. A sound that means nothing at all in a saloon full of armed men going about their business, and means everything when it happens directly behind a man whose back is turned. He didn't think about it. There wasn't time to think about it, and more than that, there wasn't a need to. 6 years of exactly this kind of attentiveness, the same attentiveness that had kept him alive through Mineral Creek and a dozen towns before it. The same instinct that read a room before his mind had finished the sentence describing what it was reading, took over entirely. He spun. The rusted revolver was already clearing leather before his boots had finished turning, and Dutch Calloway, whose own gun had barely made it free of its holster, was still a half second, a full lifetime behind him. One shot. It was the only sound in that saloon for a long moment afterward, and then Dutch Calloway was on the floorboards, and the silver dollars scattered across the table beside him seemed, in the sudden silence, like the only witnesses in the room still catching the light. Amos and Whit stood frozen at the far side of the room, hands nowhere near their guns, staring at the space where their friend had been standing, and then at Cole, and then, for the first time all afternoon, at the revolver. For itself, worn and old and exactly as unremarkable as it had looked from across the room 2 hours earlier. They understood it now, all at once, the way understanding sometimes arrives too late to do anybody any good. The gun had never been the problem. Cole holstered the revolver with the same unhurried motion he'd used to draw it. He didn't look at Amos or Whit with anything that could be called triumph, and he didn't look at Dutch on the floor with anything that could be called satisfaction either. What was on his face, if you'd asked anyone in that saloon to describe it afterward, was something closer to weariness, the specific, familiar weariness of a man who had hoped. Hoped, right up until the last half second, that this particular afternoon wouldn't end the way it had ended. He gathered the last of his winnings from the table, counted out another portion and set it beside the first on the bar, more than enough to cover whatever remained of the damage. For the trouble, he told Silas Vance. Vance, who hadn't moved from behind the bar since the shot, nodded slowly. He didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to a man who'd just settled a debt that had nothing to do with money. Cole finished the last of his whiskey, unhurried, the way he'd meant to finish it 2 hours earlier before any of this had started. He set the empty glass down, picked his hat up off the bar and settled it back into place. Then he walked out of the Larkspur Saloon into the flat gold light of a Wyoming afternoon, untied shadow from the rail, ran a hand along the black coat the way he always did, and rode on toward the meeting with Whitfield that had, this whole time, been the only reason he'd come to town at all. Behind him in the saloon, nobody moved for a long moment. Then, somewhere in the corner, the piano started up again, tentative at first, then finding its rhythm, the particular resilience of a room deciding without discussing it, that the only way through what it had just witnessed was to keep going exactly the way it was. It had been going before. I think about that piano sometimes when I tell this one. How fast a room can go back to normal after something like that. It's not that anybody forgot what happened. Every man in that saloon carried it out the door with him that night and told it a dozen different ways over the years, the story growing a little in each telling the way stories do. But the room itself, the actual physical space, just kept being a saloon. Cards got dealt again. Drinks got poured again. That's the thing about violence in a place like that. It doesn't stop the world. It just adds one more thing everybody in the room has to carry with them when they leave it. Never mention Larkspur again, not that I ever heard. Whitfield's cattle got found 3 days later, incidentally, out past a dry creek bed where a couple of hired hands had been running them slow toward a buyer who didn't ask too many questions. That's its own story, one I might tell you another time. But that afternoon in the saloon, the 12 silver dollars, the old revolver nobody thought twice about until it mattered, the young man who couldn't survive being seen losing, that one stuck with me longer than most. Maybe it's because of what Cole never said. He never told those 3 men what he'd survived to be able to shoot the way he shot. Never told them how many years, how many rooms exactly like that one it had taken to get a hand that steady and a mind that quiet in the half-second before the coin starts falling. He just let the shooting speak for itself, the way it always had, the way it probably always will. That's Cole Harland, 20 years on the road, and the only thing that's ever changed is how little he feels the need to explain himself anymore. If this is your first time riding with him, the whole story starts back at Mineral Creek, and every episode since is linked below. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't, because Cole Harland isn't finished, and neither is the road ahead of him. This is Frank, Ardell for Silver Dollar. Ride safe.